Hello, everyone. I'm Amanda Graham. I'm the Academic Director of the Irving Institute for Energy and Society. And on behalf of the Dartmouth Energy Collaborative, or the DEC, I am delighted to welcome you to today's talk. We are here today to hear about the work of Leah Stokes. Leah is a wonderful human being who I know from her years at MIT and my years at MIT. So it's a particular pleasure for me to welcome her to our Dartmouth Energy Collaborative series today. And just to give a little bit of background for Leah before she kicks off, Leah is, Dr. Stokes is a political science professor at the University of California in Santa Barbara, UCSB, where she has appointments in political science, environmental studies, and at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management. And Leah's work came back to me over the summer when I saw a Boston Globe op-ed that she wrote with Michaela Jefferson on the racism that's inherent in our fossil fuel systems. And as it turns out, Leah is widely published not just as a scholar, but also in popular literature, right? So she has also written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, CNN, NPR, National Geographic, the list goes on and on. And she's been really present in the Twitter sphere as well. One of her most recent pieces that I came across has a wonderful title. It's called, It's the Energy Policies, Stupid, where she describes how politicians are really standing in the way of both markets and public opinion in the case of energy. And here I was introduced to this fantastic concept of the narwhal curve. And so I am hoping that we will be hearing a little bit about the narwhal curve.
My first slide, Amanda, don't worry.
Fantastic, so I won't have to wait long. Leah earned her PhD and her master's degree at MIT, her MPA in environmental science and policy from Columbia, and her bachelor's in psychology and East Asian studies from the University of Toronto. And she is here as part of conversations about her new book, which is Short-Circuiting Policy, Interest Groups, and the Battle Over Clean Energy and Climate Policy in the American States. Leah, take it away. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for having me. That was a very generous introduction, Amanda. Really appreciate it. And it's great to be here with all of you today. I'm just going to get my slides set up. So as Amanda mentioned, I am going to be talking about my book, which is called Short-Circuiting Policy. And at the end, if you don't have a copy and you want one, I'm going to tell you how to buy it. But in the meantime, you can just listen. And of course, you don't have to buy a copy or anything like that. It's an academic book at the end of the day. We're not making money off this thing. So the challenge, when I was getting to the end of writing my book, I started to ask myself a question, which is, what do we actually have to do? And, you know, a lot of the discussions around the Green New Deal, for example, have really reshaped the climate policy conversation by reminding us that we have to focus on outcomes, on long-term reductions in greenhouse gases. So, for example, the IPCC 1.5 degrees report, which came out in the fall of 2018, 2 years ago, it said that we had to cut emissions by 45% by 2030 in order to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And so I started to ask myself, okay, what do we actually need to do compared to what are we doing already? So I came up with this visual called the narwhal curve, which is basically a benchmark. So you say, here's where we are today, and here's where we need to go. And if you start in the year 2000 and you draw a straight line out to 2050, what that means is that every year, clean energy needs to grow by 2 percentage points, right? Because we've got 50 years to get to 100% clean energy. And if you were to cut the data at 2018, you would see that we're at 36% clean, which is 2018 times 2, 36. You can see that black line goes right through the end of the data there. Well, that seems to suggest that we're right on track with a 2050 cleanup of the electricity system. But there's a couple of things to note even about that. You should notice that the nuclear fleet is a big orange rectangle at the bottom of the curve. And one thing you should notice is that that's not getting bigger, nor currently getting smaller. Although it could get a lot smaller if we don't have license extensions for nuclear plants. And as you can see with this graph, nuclear makes up more than half, about 55% of our clean energy resources. The same thing can be said for hydropower. Hydropower is kind of a constant, steady supply there, and it's not really getting bigger, and it's not going to get bigger because it turns out we've already developed the vast majority of our hydropower sites in this country. Now, renewables, they are the great hope, right? That's the green spikes at the top, and they are actually growing. You can see that, but they're really not growing fast enough. In the best year to date, which would be 2017 and I believe 2018, or it's either 2016 and 2017, no, it's 2016 and 2017. Renewable energy grew by a little bit less than 2 points, so 1.7 percentage points. Now, what was that benchmark that we had? It was 2 percentage points. So even in the very best years, we are not moving fast enough for a 2050 cleanup. And that's assuming, of course, that our nuclear fleet sticks around to 2050. Now, what if we made the deadline instead 2035? That is the deadline that Jay Inslee put on the table, that a lot of people are talking about, that Biden has adopted as his plan, actually. And you can see here that if we're going to draw a straight line out from 2018 to 2035, that slope is a lot steeper. We need to be moving even faster on renewables than even the 2050 target, and certainly faster than we have before. What a lot of the best modeling suggests is that we need to be moving about twice as fast as our best years ever, every single year out to 2030. And then we need to triple it or quadruple it out to 2035. And this actually obscures a couple other important facts. It turns out that we don't really need 100% clean electricity. We need more like 150% or 200%, because the scale of the electricity system needs to grow over the coming decades. Why is that? Because we have to electrify other parts of our energy system. So right now, our cars, they're running on oil, a fossil fuel, right? A liquid fossil fuel. Well, what if we wanted our cars to be clean? We could plug them into electricity. That's what an electric vehicle does. But that means we're going to need more electricity, right? Because we're already using all the electricity that we have to run our homes and our businesses and our industrial facilities. And now we're going to use more of it for more industrial facilities, for electricity, for transportation, and for our buildings. And so the amount of electricity that we're going to need is going to have to grow. And actually, Princeton University has been doing really interesting modeling on this in the past couple months, and they released some data last week. And their estimates suggest that it's at least a doubling of the current generation capacity that we have. So that's a lot more clean energy than you might have been thinking. If you're interested in this idea, I actually made a video about it called the narwhal curve with grist. It's a little nice animated thing. You can share it with friends or classes or family or anything like that. It's very accessible, and it kind of explains why we need to be moving so much faster on clean energy. Now, where are we at with solving this problem? Well, we really need our federal government to act, because the federal government can set a rule for the entire country, right? They can say that all the states have to ramp up their clean energy. And advocates have been trying to get the federal government to do that for decades. So throughout the 1990s, advocates were trying to pass what's called a renewable portfolio standard, which is a policy that says you need to have X percent, like 20% renewables by the year 2020. So there were lots of efforts to do that, and they failed. And in my book, in the third chapter, I explain what those are. Now, the Waxman-Markey bill, which you've probably heard of, that's the closest we've come to comprehensive climate policy federally. And that law included a 20% RPS by 2020. Now, it was written in such a way that you didn't really have to be 20% renewables by this year. You actually needed to be 12%, because the law said that 8% could be met with efficiency. You could make the system more efficient and you wouldn't have to grow renewables as much. Now, what I did in this book is that I looked back at that policy and I asked, would that have ramped up action faster? And the interesting thing is that it would have, because we have many states and utilities in this country that do not even have 20%, let alone 12% renewables right now. Now, that law, or that bill, did pass the House, but it did not pass the Senate. And so we never got to see what that would have done to our electricity system. In the last few months, something very transformative has happened, which is the Biden campaign has endorsed a 100% clean electricity standard by 2035. So what's the difference between an RPS and a CES? Well, an RPS is kind of an older version of this policy. It's one that really targets wind and solar. And it doesn't typically target 100%. It says, we want 20% or 33% or something like that. And what it was used for, as I'll talk about, is to ramp up renewables in the 1990s and early 2000s. But as states and cities and even the federal government started to think about 100% clean electricity, they had to think about clean, meaning that existing hydropower and nuclear would count under that target. So clean is just a bigger bucket. And technically, clean can also include natural gas, fossil gas plants with carbon capture and sequestration, meaning that they're not emitting carbon through combustion. They are sequestering it as they produce power. Now, importantly, if you're going to have natural gas with CCS count under a clean electricity standard, you have to think very carefully about methane leakage, right? Because all throughout the natural gas supply chain, particularly in the Northeast where you are, there is little leakage. There's little holes basically in the old pipes where gas escapes. And we know that methane is an extremely potent greenhouse gas, right? CH4. And it warms the planet a lot faster than carbon dioxide even. So we need to get on top of the supply chain of fossil gas if we really want to have natural gas with CCS count as part of a clean electricity standard. I will say, though, that it's going to be important to have more than just renewables, because what the modeling shows is that, you can run the system up to about 90% given the current nuclear and hydro fleet, plus all the rest being renewables. But to get to 100% is really hard to do if you're just having more renewables. So we need to have some other technologies. And if you're interested in that discussion, I just, and I'll mention this at the end again, I have a podcast called A Matter of Degrees, and it's a very highly produced narrative podcast about climate. In the last episode from Thursday of last week, we actually talked about these exact issues, and we interviewed Jesse Jenkins, a person who graduated from MIT at the same time as me and is now a professor at Princeton. And we talked to him about sort of the last 10% problem. So feel free to check that out. So states have really stepped up in the absence of federal leadership, and they've passed two main policies that have been fueling decarbonization. The first is the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which, as I mentioned, sets a target like 20% renewables and a deadline like 2030. And a lot of states passed these policies throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. And in the book, I describe sort of why did that happen. The other main policy that passed and helped to spur new clean energy, particularly solar, was net metering, or sometimes called net energy metering. Net metering is a policy that allows you to put solar on your roof and to connect that solar to the grid and to feed the excess electricity that you're generating into the grid and get paid typically the retail price. So that's why it's called net metering. You're buying a certain amount of electricity called kilowatt hours from your utility, and then you're selling a certain amount back to them at the same price. And we can take the amount that you bought minus the amount that you sold and net it out, and then that'll be your electricity bill. So let's say you bought 100 kilowatt hours, but you generated 20. You can take 100 minus 20, and you're going to only pay for 80 kilowatt hours. Now, this policy was very popular in the 90s and the 2000s because, as I argue, utilities didn't really understand solar. They didn't really understand how big this industry would be. And so they didn't anticipate that a lot of people would adopt rooftop solar and would start to feed a lot of electricity onto the grid. And at that point, it became very controversial because utilities were concerned that it was cutting into their own profits. So there are clean electricity standards now throughout the country, and a good number of them are targeting 100%. It's hard to find an updated map because it's always changing, but there are 8 states that have 100% clean electricity laws on the books. So places like California and New Mexico and New York and Washington State. There are also DC and Puerto Rico also have that law passed. So 10 jurisdictions at sort of the subnational level. And then there are 5 additional states that have done this through executive order. So we have 1 in 3 Americans right now living in a place that has 100% clean electricity targets. And it's really like 25% of our states, a quarter of our states that have acted on this. So this isn't some new idea. It's actually something that's been adopted by a very good portion of our states so far. Now, as this momentum has been growing at the state and even local level to put pressure on our federal government to act on a clean electricity standard, at the same time, interest group backlash has also been growing. And that's really what I document in my book. I tell the story of how fossil fuel companies and electric utilities have been resisting this clean energy transition. And they're using a wide variety of tactics to try to undermine what I call policy feedback. What is policy feedback? This is a key theory from political science. And the basic idea is that you have a policy, right? And it can reshape the political landscape. So we usually think about how politics, something like the election in 1 week, will reshape policy. Maybe Biden will get elected and the Senate will become Democratic and we'll get a clean electricity standard, right? So a shift in politics will create a shift in policy. But we can also reverse that relationship. We can say, well, what if we get that federal clean electricity standard? We shift the policy. How will that reshape the politics? Will, for example, some utilities become allies in the fight for clean energy? Will some states start to have more people employed in clean energy industries and therefore be more supportive of the transition? So, in other words, we're thinking about how policy itself reshapes our political system. Now, the theory behind a clean electricity standard or a renewable portfolio standard is that you'll get this positive feedback cycle, right? You'll get policy, it'll reshape the political system, and then it will reshape policy again, and you'll just get an amplifying cycle over time. Now, unfortunately, that isn't really how it came to pass. So, the policy feedback was never really kicked off because interest groups intervened, namely fossil fuel companies and electric utilities, to cut off that virtuous cycle. And what they did is that they engaged in lobbying, resisting laws implementation at public utility commissions. They engaged in primaries and elections and astroturfing, which I'm going to talk about later. And they also used court cases to try to slow down policy implementation. So this is kind of a schematic of what do I mean by policy feedback so that you can follow the argument. So, we know that there's legislatures, we have policymakers, and that they pass bills and that bills become laws, right? That's kind of the classic story. Well, what happens after the bill becomes a law? That's really what we're going to talk about here. Well, the law redistributes resources between advocates and opponent interest groups, right? Suddenly we have clean energy companies, we have solar leasing companies, we have independent power producers developing all this wind and solar, and they start to contest the power of monopoly electric utilities and fossil fuel companies. So the interest group balance of power begins to shift. We start to have more power in these new companies and slightly less power in these incumbent energy companies. Now, how do these interest groups respond? They don't just kind of say, oh, gee, shucks, you got me there. Now we're going to no longer be an industry, or now we're going to shut down coal and gas and oil. No. They fight back, right? It's kind of like a wounded animal. It fights back even harder. So interest groups can both directly lobby the legislature, which you can see that arrow there, to say, hey, we don't want you to do this. We want you to roll back this bill. And here's a bunch of money. Here's some campaign contributions. Or, hey, you're my friend. We've got this great relationship. Hey, let me write that bill. So they can work directly with the legislature. And I detail how that can happen. And, unfortunately, right now, the Republican Party in many states, and certainly federally within Congress, has a very symbiotic relationship with the fossil fuel industry. They take an enormous amount of money from the fossil fuel industry. In fact, in this week's episode of this podcast, we're talking about that, and we interviewed Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, and he said, in his experience since the Citizens United decision, the Republican Party has taken so much money from fossil fuel companies. He thinks that this might actually be their number one source of campaign funding. And so they become very much embedded within the way fossil fuel companies think about these things. And you can see that in the amount of denial that is being perpetuated by the Republican Party right now, including Donald Trump. Now, interest groups don't have to just go directly to the legislature. They can also indirectly influence policy by working with the public, okay? Now, the public, if you're an interest group and you want to organize the public, you can kind of do it in a more honest way and a more dishonest way. So what's an honest way to organize the public? Well, you could be a grassroots group like Sierra Club, let's say, and you could say, hey, to all your members, there's this long Congress that we've got to stay, we don't want it to get rolled back. Let's all write to our legislators or something like that. That's called outside lobbying. It's the idea that an interest group can organize the public and the public can speak on behalf of the interest group. And it's more honest, right? Because there are people who share the views of that interest group. There's a more dishonest way to do it, and that's called astroturfing, which is when a interest group basically makes up, pretends like there's some grassroots organization or that there's this upswelling of people who are really upset about the same thing as the interest group. But there isn't actually a bunch of people who share their views. They just made it up. So I'm going to tell you two stories of astroturfing in practice. And it's unfortunately very common with electric utilities and fossil fuel companies. So here's an example of astroturfing that I write about in my book. One of the stories in my book is about Kansas, where there was a clean energy law put in place and a lot of wind energy built. And it was very popular, including amongst Republicans. But Koch Industries, a very large and important fossil fuel company you've probably heard of, is actually headquartered in Kansas. It's headquartered in Wichita. And they didn't like this policy and they wanted to get rid of it. So what did they do? Well, suddenly this group called the Kansas Senior Alliance popped up in Kansas, and it started to send out these flyers saying Kansas seniors are already financially stressed. Higher utility bills aren't helping, right? So they created this false narrative that clean energy laws were pushing up utility bills, which was not true. And they sent that to, people in the legislature. Well, there was a journalist who wanted to understand, who's behind this group? Like, who are these seniors? Like, let's write a story about it. And there was no website, there were no names, like, who are these people? So the journalist went to the lawyer who registered this group to become, an organization. And he said, hey, you registered this group, the Kansas Seniors Alliance. Like, who do you work for there? And the lawyer said, oh, I don't work for the Kansas Seniors Alliance. I only work for Americans for Prosperity. And Americans for Prosperity, if you're not familiar with it, is this kind of fake grassroots group that Koch Industries runs. It's a big sort of public lobbying organization that exists to promote the views of Koch Industries and the Koch brothers. And they actually registered this fake group. So it wasn't a bunch of old Kansas seniors who were all worked up about this policy. It was a front group. It was a fake group. And, things can get very, even more dishonest. So here's a story from New Orleans where Entergy, a utility company, did something very bad, which is there was a decision at the New Orleans City Council as to whether or not to build a gas plant. And at the meeting, you can see a bunch of people showed up, all wearing these orange shirts. They had these sort of pre-printed signs. They don't look very grassroots, right? It's not like some kid painted these protest signs. And they showed up to the city council meeting and they said, we want this gas plant, power station equals jobs, etc. You can see the signs. And it all was about Entergy. And so a journalist went up to these people and they said, like, hey, how come you're here? And how come you really want a gas plant and you don't want like clean energy? And they said, oh, I don't want that. No, see, I'm an out of work actor and I was hired by an agency to come to this meeting. And these are my lines. This is what I'm supposed to say. So I'm like playing a character. This is a role. So Entergy, it turned out, had paid $27,000 to a PR firm who hired about a bunch of out-of-work actors and paid them to show up to this meeting. And just looking at this image, you can see how that is going to subvert public participation, because look at how many people are being paid by this utility to sort of pretend like they want this gas plant. So that's a really dishonest thing. And you see this too in places like Ohio, where that dark money campaign, the $60 million scheme that led to Larry Householder being arrested by the FBI. He was the Speaker of the Ohio House. They ran these advertisements on television claiming all kinds of lies and trying to influence the public by saying, for example, that like the Chinese government was behind this rollback of a clean energy policy, was behind blocking the rollback of this clean energy policy. And that if you really wanted to be American, you needed to back this coal they left. So there's all these kinds of very problematic things that electric utilities are doing. And it becomes even more problematic when you remember that electric utilities are monopoly companies. We all buy our electricity from these companies. We don't have a choice about who to buy from. And they're using the money that we're paying them for an essential service to do very anti-democratic things. So there's one other point I want to make before we turn to Q&A, which is that the other thing that interest groups are doing is that they are playing in primaries to drive polarization. And so you can see here that in the early 90s, a lot of Republicans supported clean electricity policies, renewable portfolio standards. They were signed under Republican governors. But when we came to the early 2000s, we couldn't find any Republicans to support these policies anymore. And that's because interest groups were primary challenging any Republican who was offside, any Republican that was pro climate action or pro clean energy. And that led to a big asymmetric polarization where the Republican Party has pulled away from the Democratic Party on these issues. So when we talk about polarization, you actually have to talk about it being asymmetric. It's not like the Democrats are becoming extreme. It really is that the Republican Party is becoming an extremist party. Now, the thing is that the mass public listens to their co-partisans. And so when we have these debates with Mike Pence or Donald Trump saying that climate change isn't real, we don't need to deal with it, that's very problematic because Republicans are going to be listening and some of them may update their views, and we may see more polarization in the mass public. And that is what happened in the post-Waxman Markey period when interest groups influenced politicians and then politicians influenced the mass public. So in this book, I go through a wide variety of cases. I talk about Texas, a very important case that a lot of people know about, Kansas, where Koch Industries is headquartered, Arizona, where Arizona Public Service, this utility, did very, very terrible stuff, and Ohio, that famous case. And if you're interested in the Ohio case, I've also written about it in Vox. There's one other thing I want to leave you with, which is that a lot of you know that fossil fuel companies like Exxon and Chevron perpetuated climate denial. But what you might not know is that electric utilities were also very involved in perpetuating climate denial. And I write about this in my book. And if you're interested in reading about that part of the book, you can also just read it online because I published an excerpt in Drilled News. So you can just Google my name or go to my website and you can find that excerpt. And you can sort of learn about the history that utilities have played in climate denial. If you'd like to get a copy of the book, you can go to bit.ly/scp-book. That will take you to the Oxford University Press website, and you can use this code. I'm happy to send it around later too, if you don't have a chance to write it down, and you can get 30% off. There's also a Kindle ebook that's cheaper, and there's also an audiobook if you're like me, and I love audiobooks. So they made an audiobook, which is super cool. So you can listen to it as well. I'll skip that if there may be questions about some of these things. The last thing I'll say is that I do a lot of other advocacy work. And as I mentioned, I have this new podcast called A Matter of Degrees. I hope you'll check it out. We do episodes on these kinds of topics, but it's way more fun and funny than an academic talk. So I think you'll enjoy it. And I also wrote an essay in this new book called All We Can Save, which is a collection of really cool essays by a diverse array of women from across the climate movement. And it's like, again, a way more fun book than an academic book. So very accessible. It has poetry and art and all that kinds of things. So at this point, I'm happy to turn it over to the Q&A.
Fantastic. Leah, thank you so much. Really fascinating and fun and illuminating. And I really appreciate that the narwhal made his or her appearance very early on in your remarks. So we do have some questions coming in. Remember, folks, send your questions or put your questions into the Q&A. Let's just jump right in. So first question from Dietmar Dettering asks, given that nuclear is carbon-free, energy dense, and that megawatt per megawatt is safer than any other energy source, what are your thoughts on anti-nuke activists and fossil fuel interests and government seeking to and succeeding in some places in replacing existing nuclear with gas and undermining deployment of new nuclear technology? So that's sort of a question, but also sort of a statement.
Yeah, so I'm used to that, no problem. Well, look, I'm not anti-nuclear by any means, and I do recognize, as I talked about, that it is the largest share of carbon-free electricity in our mix. I think that nuclear license extensions for safe plants is very important. I also think that we need to have financial support for nuclear plants where they're struggling because of cheap gas. There's been modeling that's been showing that gas is really pushing out nuclear from the mix. Now, the problem is that those supports have not been done in transparent ways. And so the nuclear industry is really harming itself in the way that it's gone about getting support for its ailing plants. So for example, in Ohio, a lot of this bribery scheme that I'm talking about was caught up with the nuclear plants. And it's clear that part of the money that was used to theoretically keep these nuclear plants open in Ohio actually went to keep open coal plants in Ohio, because there were statements made by a utility that said, if we get this money from the government, we can keep open this coal plant. And the utility was not willing to open up their books and to show exactly how much money they needed to keep their nuclear plants open. In Illinois, similarly, there was a bribery scheme to keep nuclear plants open. So, these utilities are kind of harming their own effort here. And I don't go around talking about nuclear bailouts. I don't believe in that. However, I think we do need to support nuclear plants to keep them open. However, we have to do it in a transparent way, because the worst thing possible would be for part of that money to keep coal plants open. And I'm sure the person who asked that question would agree with that statement. So you're right. We don't want to be shutting nuclear plants before we're shutting gas plants. We don't want clean energy to be replaced by fossil fuels. And we are really at a risky point for that right now. So I do think license extensions are really important. I do think shutting down nuclear plants creates a lot of big problems. However, I think the industry itself is shooting itself in the foot in the way that it's gone about trying to get support for its nuclear plants. And it needs to do a much better job of creating public support. And shady bailouts that involve arrests of legislators is not going to be great for your industry over the longer term.
Thank you. Thank you. Next question. Is it legal for an organization to hire actors to skew public perception of a political issue?
Great question. And lawyers are asking, is it legal? They're asking that about a lot of things that utilities are doing. And unfortunately, as you probably all saw yesterday, we now have a Supreme Court that is extremely unbalanced and doesn't believe in climate change. And so I don't necessarily think this is the moment to bring cases to the Supreme Court, but there are questions we should be asking about these utility tactics. So how come a monopoly company is able to take all of our money, and I'm getting phone calls, sorry, 1 second, and use that money to do things that are not in our interest, right? Like, this isn't a company that we can stop buying from if we don't like them. Like, if you don't like what Amazon is doing, you could stop buying from Amazon, although Amazon has these monopolistic things too, actually. So maybe that's not a good example. Let's say you don't like what your local grocery store is doing. You could stop buying from your local grocery store and go to a different one. But if you don't like what your electric utility is doing, like, too bad. You have to keep buying from them. And, there has been a case at the Supreme Court about unions and what unions are allowed to do politically, because they are compelling people to pay for to pay dues, and then the union gets to speak on behalf of everybody, and everybody may not agree with what they're doing. And so how come electric utilities get to do that? They get to take money from all of us, and they're doing things that we don't agree with. And gas utilities are particularly bad right now. SoCal Gas, where I live in Southern California, is doing all kinds of shady things, creating front groups that are pretending like we need to have gas. And I'm paying for that as a gas customer. I'm trying to get off gas now, but this is a problem. So, I think we do need to build the legal case against these astroturfing campaigns. And one of the arguments can be that, if we have a public comment period and we have a fake public group, that they're taking away from the ability of real public concerned members to speak, right? There's not as much time, there's not as much space. And so that's not right. They're really subverting the democratic process. So I know there are some legal organizations like Earth Justice who are asking these kinds of questions and trying to get on top of these issues, but it's a difficult thing. And it's also a reason why things like the Supreme Court or our federal courts becoming so skewed and becoming captured by really industry advocates, like Amy Coney Barrett's father was a Shell lobbyist, I believe. That becomes really problematic in terms of how our laws get enforced.
Thank you. A question from Elizabeth Wilson, our director at the Irving Institute and a professor of environmental studies. Elizabeth asks, what chapters of your book do you think would be good for a climate energy politics class?
Well, hello to my friend Elizabeth. Lovely to see you out there in the world. Well, I actually think that the third chapter, which tells the history of electric utilities from an institutional perspective, would be a great chapter to assign to classes, because it really goes through how electric utilities were developed in the early 1900s, why they became monopolies, how they created this symbiotic relationship with states through public utility commissions. And it summarizes a lot of really interesting history by people like Richard Hirsch that tells the story of the sort of utility consensus, but it does it in a political way. So it's a political history that I think can get a lot of people up to speed and understand the utility sector a lot more. And, I also wrote this book as kind of a translation piece, one that would be interesting to people who care about energy, but also interesting to political scientists. And political scientists don't know a lot about energy or climate. And so the first chapter, too, really tries to create a common framework to help people understand it. It has the narwhal curve, it explains different technologies. I think there are certain parts of the book, and you can always pick a chapter too from one of the cases later on, and it tells the political history of a given state and what has happened. So yeah, I think the book is pretty accessible for courses, and I know it's being assigned. Yesterday, I talked to a CU Boulder class about reading the book. So yeah, lots of cool chunks that can be used in classes.
Great, thank you. John Jeffers asks, in the relative absence of progress in federal and state policy to encourage adoption of renewables, how and where is progress being made? I see a lot of wind and utility scale solar installations. What forces are causing these to be built? Is it possible that consumer and investor pressure can drive transition faster than policy can?
Well, that's an interesting question. No, I don't think that the voluntary corporate or individual action will solve this problem at all. I deeply believe in policy, and the progress that we're seeing is driven by policy. It's driven by the policies I talked about today, the state renewable portfolio standards and net metering laws, and critically, their combination with federal tax credits. And so we have two tax credits I didn't mention, but they're the investment tax credit and the production tax credit, and those have been critical to spurring solar in the case of the ITC and wind in the case of the PTC. And during the beginning of the Obama administration, Joe Biden actually presided over the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, which included $90 billion for a massive build out of renewables. And that actually was implemented through grants rather than through tax credits. And grants are particularly helpful because you can get the money up front, you don't have to hold the tax liability. And there are some companies and individuals who don't have tax liability for the federal government and can't access those tax credits in the same way. So both the House and Senate have had these committees where they've been talking about how do we do better climate policy, and they've both endorsed the idea of grants again. And these are Democrats, by the way, in the House and the Senate. And so, scaling up a grants program could really ramp up the policy even faster. Now, there are some corporate actors that are leading the way, and I had one slide that I skipped over about Google. Google has committed to a 100% clean electricity target by 2035. And that clean electricity target is very different from existing corporate targets because it's not about buying what's called RECs, renewable energy certificates, which is basically I bought some clean power, I hear my credits that show I bought it, yay. But that power is not really delivered to your facilities, right? Like maybe it's in the region, it's going around, but that's just not how electricity works. But what Google has committed to doing is saying we're going to have 100% clean electricity at all our facilities across this country by 2030 in real time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That is a huge, huge step forward. It's never been done before. And what people may not know is that Google is potentially one of maybe the largest or one of the largest and electricity consumers in this country. So this is not like some small company being like, we're going to have rooftop solar with batteries. It's like a giant company saying we're going to do this. So that kind of corporate leadership is really important because it's spurring not just a lot of clean energy, but actually a sea change in technology and operations to say that we're going to have this in real time. So I'm certainly not against corporate leadership, but we have to be able to distinguish between real corporate pledges like this Google pledge and really not real ones, which is what most utilities have been up to. And I'm actually writing this report right now with the Sierra Club where we talk about why utility pledges are not real pledges. So that'll come out in the new year.
Great. Thank you so much.
Marjorie Rogalski from our Upper Valley area asks about New Hampshire, and the state recently passed legislature allowing community and municipal aggregation power purchasing, and a number of towns and cities in the state are working on moving towards this. However, the PUC, the Public Utilities Commission, and Liberty and Eversource Utilities don't want it to happen, says Marjorie. Can you identify any resources for towns that want to develop this kind of power purchase option?
Yeah, so sometimes we call this community choice aggregation. It's a policy that's been used a lot in the Northeast, also in California, and it allows sort of towns and cities and counties to have their own power. The really gold standard or highest bar that we would want those things to meet is like the Google pledge I just talked about. What we really want is cities and towns to be delivering real-time clean power, sort of 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And a lot of these organizations have struggled to do that because it's really hard to do, and particularly in a small area. So what they end up doing is buying these RECs and not necessarily building a lot of new projects. And so we really want local cities and towns to use all that excitement that they have to build real stuff and deliver real power. And that if CCAs can't clear that bar and they're just buying RECs, then they're not really adding a lot of new clean energy to the system. In terms of how you can get around utility resistance, it's very difficult, but reading my book, you may find it helpful because I talk about all the tactics that they use and how they resist implementation. You have to develop relationships with commissioners and with legislators. You have to develop a public advocacy campaign where you've got people in the streets protesting at public utility commissions when there's decisions being made. You have to really counter the power that the utilities have because they are in a very symbiotic relationship with public utility commissions, and they have a very much guaranteed seat at the table. And they also have sort of like unlimited resources to spend on this because they're monopolies. So you're taking on a Goliath is what I mean to say. And it's a difficult thing to do. But even if you lose, don't lose heart, because what you're doing is you're putting pressure on the utility to move faster, right? You're saying, hey, we want to move faster. You're not moving fast enough. So for example, in Boulder, Xcel, as they've been trying to create their own utility in Boulder, Colorado for a long time, and Xcel has been fighting them for like literally a decade. But meanwhile, Xcel has become one of the best utilities in the country because they're facing all this bottom-up pressure. So even when you're not successful, you can still win in some ways. You can still get the outcome that you want, which is that you're putting more pressure on the utility to move faster.
Thank you. Patrick Brown asks, lots of grassroots activism focuses on the fossil fuel industry as the culprit behind climate obstruction, but you note that utility companies are also contributing. Do you see potential in divestment campaigns focused on utilities? Otherwise, what are some openings for activism in this area?
Yeah, great question. I think that the key thing is getting utility money out of politics, because as we've talked about, utilities have so much money, right? They have this endless source of resources. So we need to get utility money out of politics. So the No Fossil Fuel Money Pledge actually includes, which is about politicians saying, I'm not going to take money from fossil fuel companies, includes utilities. But a lot of people don't know that. And in Virginia, an organization called Clean Virginia ran a campaign to get state legislators and the people running for the governor to stop taking money from Dominion. It was like a no Dominion money pledge. That's the utility there. So you could think about like a no Eversource money pledge or whatever it is. And what that will do is it can get the utility money out of politics and make it more likely that your legislators and your regulators and all these people are going to listen to the public rather than listening to these utilities. And I think eroding the social license of utilities to play so intensely in politics is a really important thing to do. So it's not just divestment in terms of like who's invested in these companies. It's also these companies' ability to use their money and profits for political ends. And if we can cut that off by saying to politicians, you got to stop taking money from these guys, then we can start to get more sort of public voices into the decision-making process.
Great, thank you. The questions are great, folks. Keep them coming. These are great. Leah Brams asks, what do you think should be the role of state versus federal government in advancing climate policy?
Well, I talked a lot about that in my talk today, and I talk about it in my book too. You know, we've made a fair amount of progress at the state level over the past several decades. That's what my book shows. But I also really show the limits of only working at the state level or the local level, you know, like with these community choice programs that we're talking about. You know, it's hard for these things to scale up to the crisis. So there's this whole, you know, we're still in thing where when the federal government said they were going to pull out of Paris, a bunch of cities and states said we're still in, and that adds up to like, I don't know, a third of our emissions or something like this. And like, that's great. I don't want to at all tell people that the efforts that they're making in the absence of federal leadership are not great, because they are great, but they're insufficient, right? And we all know that. We all see, if you listen to what Greta Thunberg is saying, or you look at the science, like, we are not moving fast enough. And so what the federal government can do is that they can set a standard for the whole country. They can say that West Virginia only having 5% clean electricity is not okay. That Florida only having 15% is not okay. And they can kind of break some of the symbiotic logjam that we're talking about here between interest groups and their regulators and legislators by kind of coming in from the top and imposing it at another level so that we don't have the same kind of interest group capture. Now, of course, that assumes that we don't have interest group capture of Congress, which of course we do. So it's going to be hard to do it at the federal level, and we've never managed to do it yet. But if we could do it, it would really unlock progress at a much broader scale across the entire country. The other thing the federal government can do, right, is it's the purse, right? It has the power of the purse. It has so much money. And if you just look at the CARES Act was an enormous amount of money, trillions potentially, and the government just said, we're going to spend that federally. Well, states can't do that, particularly not in this moment when so many state finances are just in terrible shape. They can't just spend a ton of money. And so we need the federal government to do that. And I'll also say, we're going to have this episode of our podcast on Thursday, which is about the CARES Act. And what a lot of people don't know is that when the federal government did that under the current Congress, you know, run by Mitch McConnell and the current presidency, they actually funneled hundreds of billions of dollars during the pandemic to fossil fuel companies. The Fed, these tax loopholes, the Paycheck Protection Program, there's all these things that were done. And we don't even know how much money has gone to bailing out the fossil fuel industry during the pandemic. So, you know, you can see the power of the federal government to work against us in terms of the amount of money that they have to prop up an industry that's in terrible financial shape. And we need that kind of money to be flowing in the other direction, right? To build up this clean energy industry, to start training people into jobs, to start building massive amounts of infrastructure. So that's why I'm so bullish on the federal government. I've spent the last 2 years so focused on the federal government because we're about to enter a policy window, which is an opportunity to get something done federally. And those don't come around every year, as those of us who do this for a while know. So as much as I love the states and I love what they've been doing, I would encourage everybody to be very focused in 2021 in your advocacy. You know, if you've got citizen groups, you want to write letters, call people, we're going to need to be very focused on the federal government, because that will be an opportunity to scale up all that we've been doing at the state and local level to a really important next level.
Thank you. I've got a related question, but before we get to that, I've got a request for you to put back up your slide for ordering your book, please.
Oh, okay, sure, I can do that. And who knows, I have a Google slide too I didn't show.
Okay, so put that up for just a minute or so, that'd be great. And then we have a question, a related question. It looks like the solution in every state should be custom made, and that there isn't a unique recipe for the whole US, right? So this is back to that state and federal dynamic here. With so much polarization and even fear of communism, how do you envision the acceptance of newly introduced laws and reforms, you know, in this current political moment?
It's interesting how much we accept extremism from the right? Like, this person has framed this around communism. Why are we not terrified of fascism right now? Why are we not terrified of the fact that people can't vote without being harassed, which is illegal in this country? That people can't vote without having to stand in line for 10 hours, which shouldn't be allowed in this country, right? And that overwhelmingly those people who can't vote are Black people, right? Like, why are we not terrified of fascism? I'm terrified of fascism, I got to tell you. So, you know, I think that in many ways, the left is not or the Democrats, they're not winning the culture war, by which I mean we're kind of giving up the narrative to the right. And so when we talk about how polarized everything is again, I want to point out what research shows is that we are not polarized like the Democrats are some communist party and the Republicans are fascists. We're actually polarized like this. That is what the data shows. The Republican Party has become an extremist party. The Democrats have mostly stayed in the same place. And you can see that when you look at the youth climate movement, right? They're putting so much pressure on people like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer to say like, hey, you got to do something about this. And the Democratic Party is not like really talking at the scale of this crisis. I have a lot of meetings right now with Senate offices, and I got to tell you, like passing some of the ideas that Biden is putting forward, which are very reasonable ideas, right? Biden is not some leftist. He's very much a centrist, and he's put forward a really good climate plan that's about investment and about job creation and about growth. You know, that's hard to even find the Democrats to vote for that. So the party itself is not very effective at messaging. It's not very effective at cohesion. And so I think it's going to be difficult to pass these things. And keep in mind that like we have news media organizations like Fox News that have huge platforms that reach millions of people and that put out these other narratives and really promote an erosion of our democratic norms in this country. So I think we need to be very clear-eyed about what we're facing. And, you know, I'm an immigrant to the United States. I'm originally from Canada. I wasn't raised in this political system. And I got to say, like, it is terrifying watching this country descend into fascism. Like, it is really scary. And I'm sure many Americans feel the same way, but, you know, it's really scary. So I don't accept that framing. Taking on the climate crisis and wanting a livable future for current and future generations is not a lefty scheme. It's not left or right. It's just about basic undergirding of our economy. If we don't have stability in our weather systems, we can't build infrastructure, right? Our homes could burn down in fires or be destroyed in hurricanes. The costs of inaction are so big, and we can't continue to let a small industry tell the story of why, you know, we don't need to act on climate change. It's really interesting. After the last debate, Biden, you know, he said, we got to get off fossil fuels, which is just a fact. That's not some radical statement. Like, you want to have a stable climate, you have to get off fossil fuels. And he was focusing a lot on getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies, which again, we spend $20 billion every year, year in, year out on fossil fuel subsidies. Shouldn't be a controversial thing to say we shouldn't do that. Well, what did Trump say during the same debate about climate change? He said, oh, you know, we don't need to act on it. You know, it's not a thing. He doesn't really believe in it. What was the news coverage like coming out of that? Well, Emily Atkin, who's an independent climate journalist, did an analysis, and there were like 5 times more articles that talked about Biden, you know, destroying the fossil fuel industry than there were about Trump destroying the planet, right? And so there's an asymmetry in how we think about costs and how we think about the costs of acting, the cost of climate policy versus the costs of not acting. And the costs of not acting are really, really large. And we need the media to be telling stories to people about, hey, those forest fires all across the West Coast, that's climate change. Hey, those endless hurricanes that we've literally run out of letters of the alphabet, that's climate change. Hey, sea level rise in the Northeast and storms, that's climate change. Drought, endless heat waves, climate change. So if we don't tell these stories, if we don't have a media that is telling the narrative of the costs in the present, it's going to be really hard for people to make those connections. So one of the things that I do, and I'll just show you this, is I've made these climate fact sheets, and you can download them. There's the links that explain the links between extreme events and climate change using peer-reviewed scientific literature. So a lot of people might say, how can you say a given heat wave or a given fire is caused by climate change? Well, the science actually allows us to do that now. So I think it's really important that we all try to make these connections and, you know, write to our media to talk to them about making these connections. You can write letters to the editor, you know, you can share these fact sheets with anybody. They're free. And they can give you this information. And so, you know, I think that we really have a failure to communicate the climate crisis through our media. And it's really problematic in terms of making progress.
Thank you. I think we're wrapping up now in the next couple of minutes, but we've got 2 more questions. So let's see if we can get quick responses into these 2 questions.
James McCullough asks, do you think wind and solar will eventually become inexpensive enough to not need government subsidies to be economic, allowing these energy types to proliferate regardless of who is in office?
Well, they're actually kind of already there. And it's interesting because people don't know that, and it's not the narrative, right? Again, there's such a narrative problem that we have, right? Like, do you think fracking will become cheap enough that it won't need government bailouts and subsidies? How come nobody asks that question? And yet, you know, fracking companies like do not make money, and massive amounts of them have gone bankrupt during the current crisis and laid off like 100,000 people. That's not the narrative that we hear, right? But fracking is not a money-making business. It's a very speculative business, and people don't make money. And you know, why do fossil fuel companies need $20 billion for a century to continue to operate? And there's a lot of evidence that there's a lot of fossil fuels that if you get rid of those fossil fuel subsidies, they're not going to be competitive anymore. So I take the person's point that we want things to be happening irrespective of, you know, what the government can do. But it's not that simple, because what has the Trump administration been doing? They've been trying to make fossil fuels cheaper. So the market is not some magical thing that is independent of government policy, right? Like, even if we were to take away subsidies from wind and solar and they'd be really cheap, we can subsidize fossil fuels to make them more competitive. And that's exactly what the Trump administration has been doing. So like I mentioned, the CARES Act, hundreds of billions of dollars have gone to fossil fuel industries. And, you know, when we talk about the Recovery Act, it was only 90 billion for renewables. Like, these are not the same order of magnitude. And you know, when you look at the amount of money that's going to prop up fossil fuels is huge. I'll also mention the minimum offer price rule. There was a decision through FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, to basically subsidize coal. So right now, in certain parts of the country, we have markets, right, in our electricity system where different providers are bidding in, wind and solar and coal. And what this decision did is that they said that coal gets a subsidy, that they don't have to bid the lowest price, basically. And so, well, specifically, wind and solar have to bid higher. So we can actually distort the market to make wind and solar less competitive, even though economically they are very competitive. So there's lots of subsidies going into coal, and it's not as simple as just saying, you know, let's get rid of subsidies for wind and solar.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I want to try to squeeze in this last question because it's a real good one, and we've got very little time. So if you can give try for a 30-second response to Marissa Bell. Marissa asks, how can we be mindful of and ensure energy justice in the context of energy transitions, in particular, ensuring fairness of process and inclusion of diverse perspectives in energy decision making? And I'm so sorry to ask you to try to squeeze that question into a short reply.
No problem. It's something I work on. Well, I think what's important to recognize is that we don't have energy justice at all. And so I wrote that op-ed that Amanda talked about in the Boston Globe. And I've actually been doing this project mapping wind protests across the country. And the wind protests are very common in the Northeast. That's something we find compared to other parts of the country. And overwhelmingly, the best predictor of where you get wind protests is the percent of the community that's white. And so white communities are rejecting clean energy. And what does that mean? It means that we keep polluting fossil fuels in Black backyards for longer periods of time. So when we talk about justice and processes, we have to recognize that there are asymmetries in who gets to participate based on resources. And of course, because we have a racial wealth gap in this country and a racial income gap, overwhelmingly, white people are more able to participate in decision-making processes and block clean infrastructure that would allow dirty infrastructure to shut down. So I do think that justice is really important. And I'll just say that Joe Biden in his plan has said that 40% of federal investments are going to go to frontline communities, including like Black communities. So I think it's really important that we do center justice in our policy making going forward.
Thank you, Leah. Good place to end on. And this is our closing segment of our election issues focused series this fall that we've been having. And then we'll be tuning in next week to see how things go. Really appreciate your insights and the sharing of your materials with us. So thank you again. Stephanie, can you go ahead and put up the slide for our upcoming events with the Irving Institute? Thank you, Steph. So we have our, if you're a student at Dartmouth, an undergrad or a grad student, please note our mini grant applications for the winter term are due on Monday, November 2nd. A week from tomorrow, we have a new energy conversation with Saurabh Biswas from ASU. And then 2 weeks after that, another new energy conversation with Tony Reams from University of Michigan. So tune in, keep tuning in, folks. We really appreciate your participation, and stay well, be healthy, and go vote. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time. Take care. Thanks again, Leah.
Bye. Thanks for having me. Vote, vote, vote.
Great to have you.